Hello, everyone, and welcome to Terrifying Trios. For July's episode, the theme/connective tissue is one of the best and scariest parts of many horror movies: family. Sources for this episode include Wikipedia, Google, Rotten Tomatoes, and Netflix, since that's where I streamed some of what I'll be talking about. As always, let's start with a quick content warning. All of the following titles are rated R due to graphic violence against women and children in particular. Death, blood, murder, sexual content, psychological stress, self-harm, suicide, homophobia, and child abuse. Viewer and reader discretion is advised. Our first movie, or rather duology of movies, is A Quiet Place, Parts 1 and 2. If you haven't seen either, note that spoilers are ahead. The second movie in this series finally made it to theaters earlier this year, and I enjoyed seeing it at the drive-in. In each film, a family starring Emily Blunt and John Krasinski as the mom and dad, with 3 children, is trying to survive after an alien invasion wipes out most of humanity. These aliens use sound to hunt, so any loud noise can attract them, which causes intentional and unintentional deaths throughout both films. The Abbott family has fared better than most when we first meet them. The eldest child, Reagan, is deaf, so the Abbotts can communicate nonverbally with sign language. Because of this, there isn't a ton of dialogue or sound in these movies, which really ratchets up the tension. Quiet scenes are inevitably shattered by sound eventually, but as a viewer, you can feel yourself getting tense after a while, wondering when the silence will be broken and what the consequences will be. Of course, the opening scene of the first film shows the family paying the price for being the source of a sudden loud sound. The youngest son is killed, and Reagan blames herself, damaging her previously close relationship with her dad, which we see at the beginning of the second movie, a flashback to the alien invasion that started it all. Nearly 2 years later, in part 2, Reagan is determined to finish what her father started. After leaving the family farm, which did begin to burn down at the end of the first movie, the surviving Abbotts venture into town and run into an old family friend, Emmett, who reluctantly tries to help Reagan find what she's looking for: a safe home for her family, but also a way to stop the aliens. Meanwhile, Mom Evelyn is still coping with the loss of her husband Lee, her injured son Marcus, and the new baby she had in the first movie. Also, she stepped on a nail in one of horror's most cringe-inducing moments of realistic body horror. A Quiet Place Part 2 follows Reagan and Emmett, and Evelyn, Marcus, and the baby, and there are some really fantastic scenes in which parallel dangers force the separate groups to improvise to survive. And there are a number of scenes where just a shot of an object gives you a gnawing sense that something bad is going to happen. The Chekhov's gun in this movie is an oxygen tank needed to keep the baby alive while he's locked in a box so his cries won't attract aliens. There's also a vault in Emmett's home, in some kind of old abandoned factory, that can latch if characters aren't careful. And of course, the boat near the end of the film tells you that an alien attack is imminent. If you're looking for a gripping series about how far people will go to protect their families and survive, though you can't always do both, watch these. Our next film is actually a trilogy of films. Fear Street, new on Netflix this July. If you grew up loving books by R.L. Stine, then these movies will be a fun blast from the past, as well as a satisfying exploration of how certain horror tropes work and how they can be subverted. Also, two films boast killer, pun intended, soundtracks. The first film starts in 1994 and focuses on Dina, a resident of Shadyside, who is breaking up with her girlfriend Sam, who just moved to Sunnyvale. For generations, while Sunnyvale has prospered, the neighboring town of Shadyside is plagued by terrible murder sprees every few years, giving it the nickname Killer Capital USA. After 8 people die brutally at the local mall, in the prologue of the film, a candlelight vigil over in Sunnyvale ends in a fight breaking out after Sunnyvalers mock the Shadysiders' latest tragedy. When a car containing Sam and her new boyfriend starts following the Shadyside bus home, Dina snaps and gets a nosebleed, a recurring important visual in these movies. And Dina and her friend Kate push a cooler out the bus's emergency exit, causing the car behind them to crash. This crash leads to Sam bleeding on the bones of Sarah Fear, a supposed witch killed in 1666 and who is blamed by many for the murders that have happened in Shadyside ever since. Most people don't believe this legend is really true, but Dina's younger brother Josh is something of an expert. And when killers of the past appear and come after Sam, it's clear that some force really won't rest until she's dead. But Josh knows that someone survived the 1978 massacre, so our heroes make a plan. Kill Sam on purpose, then resuscitate her. I really enjoy these movies for a couple of reasons. First, this is the rare horror series where gay people and people of color are not only the main characters, but actually survive the carnage of the films. And with the second film taking place in 1978, we get to see how some Shadyside characters became who they are by 1994, including C. Berman, the only survivor of the Camp Nightwing massacre, and Sheriff Nick Good, whose move from Sunnyvale to Shadyside and his survival in 1978 is an interesting detail. Something I noticed, as a rule, Sunnyvalers aren't killed by people possessed by Sarah Fier, and Nick only gets hurt protecting Ziggy in 1978. Then again, Sam's boyfriend is killed in 1994, so this rule isn't ironclad, although it's possible that he was also a transplant from Shadyside. The third film, set mostly in 1666, was a fun way, I think, to bring the casts of the first two movies together as residents of the town of Union, which split into Shadyside and Sunnyvale after the events of this movie. For me, though, this was the hardest one to watch, because you see Dina experiencing life as Sarah Fier, and at the start of the film, she has family, friends, and a place in her community. By the end, she's become something else, and the injustice of her fate is infuriating. But, at least back in 1994, where the film returns to later, Dina's love for Sam is enough to save her, ultimately, and though Sam's sacrifice saves Dina and Josh in the first film, we see that persecution can be more powerful than any family ties, particularly in insular communities, where any kind of deviance, religious or sexual, isn't tolerated. Homophobia in 1666 didn't surprise me, of course, but I was a bit puzzled at Dina/Sarah Fier's family being coded as Irish, since Irish immigrants didn't arrive in America until the 18th century. Of course, this is a minor quibble, and this is less about historical accuracy and more about establishing Sarah as a minority whose place on the margins of the community makes it easier for people to ostracize her, accuse her of witchcraft, and ultimately convict her of a crime that someone else committed, thereby cursing the community. And of course, descendants of the truly guilty party are still around in 1994, which makes the conclusion of the film that much more chilling. But satisfying, too. So if you have Netflix and are looking for several hours of scary movies to enjoy, check out this entertaining series. Finally, this month's book is a classic of the horror genre, The Shining, by Stephen King. This novel is one of his most beloved and most frightening, and while this book offers a look at the dark side of family, since patriarch Jack Torrance eventually attempts to murder his wife and son, the sequel, Dr. Sleep, explores how family, both found and biological, can be a healing force, too. When struggling writer Jack Torrance gets a job as caretaker of the Overlook Lodge, his wife Wendy is relieved. They need the money, and maybe Jack can finish his next book. And at first Jack is happy in the new surroundings, but gradually, as winter goes on, things change. While the movie adaptation of this film is full of beautiful visuals and haunting moments, I prefer the book both because it features a major character not dying in the climax, but also because you get a better sense of the feelings of isolation engendered by the setting. Jack's descent into madness is something that as a reader you experience alongside him, and this is definitely a book that, if you read it in the winter, for example, when darkness comes early and even the days are inhospitable, it might give you nightmares. Jack is more sympathetic in the book, again, because you experience so many scenes with him, but there's still Wendy's worry about Danny's broken arm. Was it really an accident? And then you have Danny's experiences with his power, the Shining, which allows him to see things that others can't. The Overlook is itself a character, a haunted hotel that some guests have never truly left. But the haunted people residing in it seem to be what awakens its terrible power. Danny in particular, because, again, he's just a kid, but the Shining means he can see a lot of secrets that no one wants to see, no one should have to see, but Danny does. While writing this, my Googling led me to the theory that both Jack and Danny had the Shining, which is certainly something I wouldn't rule out without rereading the novel. And again, if you enjoy this novel, check out the sequel, Dr. Sleep, which also is a movie adaptation and reintroduces us to Danny Torrance as an adult, trying to move past the trauma of his childhood. Ultimately, The Shining is one of the scariest books I've ever read because it shows how places and circumstances can change people, even people with good intentions, even people who don't mean to do harm. And the tragedy of Jack Torrance is that he certainly didn't come to the Overlook planning to kill his family. But plans change, and people change, and sometimes forces beyond our control reshape our lives forever. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back again soon with another terrifying trio.